An elderly black man in a pristine Lincoln gets pulled over in a small southern town. The officer sees expensive car, calm demeanor, and something just doesn't add up in his mind. So he demands the trunk be opened. Inside, white flowers, a wooden box, and a fedora. Nothing illegal. But what the officer doesn't know, what he should have known, is that this man once signed the very laws he's now bending. This traffic stop will go viral. It will spark a national conversation, and it will force an entire system to ask one devastating question. How long have we been looking away? If stories that challenge what we think we know about justice matter to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what happens next changes everything. Officer Vincent Cole drove his patrol car with the radio on, but muted, his fingers tapping the steering wheel in that restless way cops do when they're waiting for something to feel wrong. He didn't need a red light run, didn't need speeding or a broken taillight. For Vincent, all it took was a feeling, a hunch, a sense that something didn't fit the picture he'd built in his mind of what belonged and what didn't. And then he saw it, an old Lincoln, matte black, untinted windows, moving slow and steady down the empty road. No swerving, no erratic turns, nothing illegal, nothing suspicious. But Vincent's gut tightened anyway. The car looked expensive, too expensive, and the man behind the wheel, an elderly black man in a gray felt hat and brown button vest, looked like he was dressed for a funeral, not a Tuesday morning drive. Vincent muttered under his breath, "Fancy car, but doesn't look wealthy. That's suspicious." He flipped on the red and blue lights. The Lincoln pulled over immediately. No hesitation, no argument, just a calm, practiced obedience that somehow made Vincent even more uneasy. He stepped out of his cruiser, hand resting on his holster, not out of fear, but habit, the kind of habit you develop when you've been trained to see danger in stillness. The old man rolled down his window, slowly, quietly, his eyes steady, not darting, not pleading, just watching, like he could see through Vincent in a way that made the officer feel suddenly transparent. "Good morning," Vincent said, his tone flat. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The old man tilted his head slightly. His voice was soft but deliberate. "I suppose you have your reasons. And I suppose I shouldn't presume to guess." Vincent frowned. The answer was polite, but it wasn't submissive. It wasn't the nervous stammering he was used to. It was like splashing cold water on glass, clear, but somehow distorting everything. "Where are you headed?" Vincent asked louder this time. "I am going to a farewell," the old man replied. "Who passed?" The man paused. Then, with a kind of sadness that didn't need explanation, he said, "A piece of history." Vincent didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't cooperation either. It was something else, something that made him feel like he was losing control of a conversation he was supposed to be leading. He went back to his cruiser and ran the plates. Everything came back clean. He stared at the rearview mirror. The old man sat perfectly still, hands on the wheel, eyes forward, unmoving, unbothered. Vincent returned and asked for ID. The man handed over a slim black wallet. Inside was a government-issued card with a faded silver seal. Vincent turned it over, squinting at the emblem. He'd never seen one like it. "Nice forgery," Vincent said, half joking, half probing. The old man didn't flinch. "If you think it's fake, call it in." Vincent wasn't expecting that. He wanted resistance. He wanted something to justify the stop, to prove his instincts right. But there was nothing. Just calm. Just dignity. And somehow, that felt like the greatest threat of all. "I'm going to ask you to open the trunk," Vincent said. "For what reason?" "I suspect there's something unusual." The old man's gaze sharpened, just slightly. "Would you mind putting that suspicion in writing?" Vincent stepped back. His chest tightened. He wasn't being defied, but he wasn't in control either. And that scared him more than any confrontation ever had. He called dispatch. When they asked for the name, Vincent leaned into the radio and said, "Elton Pierce." There was a pause, 3 long seconds. Then the voice on the other end changed, deeper, colder, more careful. Are you requesting verification for Elton Pierce? Vincent's fingers stopped tapping. Yes, that's what the ID says. Silence. Then typing. Then a voice that wasn't dispatch anymore. Someone higher up. Someone who knew exactly who that name belonged to. Vincent hung up. His hands were shaking. He walked back to the car, throat dry, and asked the old man to step out and open the trunk. The man did, slowly, gracefully, without protest. Inside the trunk was a bouquet of white flowers wrapped in brown paper, a folded fedora, and a small wooden box engraved with the name Elton Pierce. Vincent stared. There were no weapons, no drugs, nothing illegal, just memory, just grief. The old man turned to him, and for the first time, Vincent saw something in his eyes that made him want to disappear. Not anger, not hatred, just sadness. The kind of sadness you feel when you watch someone destroy something they don't even know is sacred. You're doing your job, the old man said quietly. I understand, but that job doesn't give you the right to misread who I am. Vincent said nothing. He had no words, no defense, no protocol for this. And then, from the sidewalk, a woman holding a grocery bag stopped and stared. Her eyes went wide. Her voice cracked as she said, "Oh God, that's him." Vincent turned. You know him? The woman looked at Vincent like he'd just committed a crime he didn't even understand yet. He's the one who signed the release for my brother when everyone thought the boy deserved punishment. He saw something in him that no one else in that courtroom dared to see. And now you're stopping him. Vincent felt the ground shift beneath him. He didn't know who Elton Pierce was, but everyone else did. And in that moment, Vincent Cole realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had just pulled over a man who had spent decades shaping the law. A man who had signed rulings that protected people like Vincent's own son. A man who didn't need to defend himself because the system he helped build should have already known better. The old man got back into his car. He adjusted his rear-view mirror, started the engine, and drove away, slowly, steadily, leaving Vincent standing alone in the middle of the road, badge still on his chest, but feeling like it had just been stripped away. Vincent Cole stood in the middle of that empty road long after the Lincoln disappeared. The wind picked up, slipping through the seams of his uniform, and for the first time in his career, he felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. He didn't know it yet, but a young man across the street had recorded the entire stop on his phone. Not Vincent. The camera was pointed at the old man, at the way he opened his trunk with trembling hands, at the dignity in his posture, even as he was being questioned like a suspect. The young man whispered into his phone as he filmed, "I'm not recording the cop. I'm recording dignity, because some people go a lifetime without seeing it." By the time Vincent returned to his patrol car, that video had already been uploaded. No dramatic music, no filters, just 45 seconds of an elderly black man standing beside his open trunk, a bouquet of white flowers resting on the lid, facing an officer whose suspicion was written all over his face. The first comment appeared within minutes. "I don't know who he is, but the way he stayed silent made me ashamed for thinking this wasn't my problem." 2 hours later, the video had 200,000 views. Vincent sat in his cruiser, staring at his phone. His wife had texted him. Just 2 words. "You okay?" He didn't reply. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know if okay applied to who he was anymore. The name started circulating by midday. Not Elton Pierce. That was the name Vincent had called in. But the name the system knew him by. The name that made dispatch go silent. The name that made senior officers stop mid-sentence when they heard it. Judge Franklin O.L.L. Gaines. The man who had helped draft the 2003 Civil Rights Reform Act. The man who had sat on the state Supreme Court for nearly 3 decades. The man who had turned down 3 Senate nominations because he believed his work was on the bench, not in politics. The man Vincent Cole had just treated like a criminal. Vincent's phone buzzed. A news alert. Elderly Supreme Court justice stopped by police. Video goes viral. His stomach dropped. By evening, the story wasn't just local anymore. It was national. News outlets replayed the clip. Legal analysts dissected every moment. And slowly, painfully, Vincent began to understand what he'd done. But the worst part, the part that made him unable to sleep that night, it wasn't just him. The next morning, an independent newsroom published a leaked series of internal emails from the Monroe Police Department. Messages from 3 years ago. Conversations between mid-level commanders. And there, in cold clinical language, was the truth Vincent had never wanted to face. Cole tends to react a bit fast with black folks, but results haven't been bad. Another email from 2 years prior. Let's not intervene unless there's a formal complaint. Scrubbing data would tank our numbers. And the one that made Vincent's blood run cold. Monitor Cole closely. Indications of racially skewed target selection. Recommendation, reassigned to non-public role. That email had been sent to the department's legal chief. It had never been forwarded, never acted upon. It had sat in a draft folder for 2 years, waiting for someone to care enough to send it. Vincent stared at his computer screen, hands shaking. They had known. His superiors had known. The people who handed him awards for high detection rates had known he was profiling, and they had done nothing. The system hadn't just failed Judge Gaines. It had created Vincent Cole, applauded him, protected him, and when the truth finally came out, it left him standing alone to face the consequences of a failure that was never just his. The hashtag exploded overnight. Hashtag signed in silent. People began digging. Payroll records, assignment logs, monthly meeting notes. Documents that once seemed boring and bureaucratic were now evidence of something much darker, a system that had seen the warning signs and chosen to look away. One former employee, who had left after a labor dispute, came forward with a memo from 2021. It showed that Vincent's own supervisor had been warned by Internal Affairs. Monitor Delroy closely indications of racially skewed target selection. But no one had signed off. No one had forwarded it. It had simply stopped. When the legal chief was asked in a closed-door interview why he never acted, he said 5 words that would haunt the department forever. I thought someone else would. That phrase spread like wildfire. A remix video of the quote, looped under somber music, hit 5 million views in 2 days. And suddenly, this wasn't about Vincent Cole anymore. It was about every person in the system who had seen something wrong and waited for someone else to fix it. Vincent was pulled from traffic duty, reassigned to records. No public contact, no uniform, just a desk in the back office where he filed paperwork and tried not to meet anyone's eyes in the hallway. But the story kept growing. At a state legislative hearing on police reform, lawmakers filled the chamber, ready to discuss new policies, new training, new oversight. And then, without announcement, without fanfare, a man in a charcoal coat walked through the door. Judge Franklin O.L.L. Gaines. He didn't sit in the front row with the officials. He didn't ask for a microphone. He walked to the 5th row from the back, sat down beside the emergency exit, and opened a plain notebook. He said nothing, but the entire room felt his presence like a shift in atmospheric pressure. A young delegate stood up mid-session, voice trembling. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have data. I don't have a reform plan. But I know someone in this room today, someone who once made my father stay in law school because of a single sentence he overheard in a courtroom in 1999. The room turned. Judge Gaines didn't look up. He just kept writing, his pen moving steadily across the page, as if documenting a trial that had no judge but all the testimonies it needed. Later, a former clerk of his rose to speak. He never taught me how to win a case. He taught me how not to win and still keep my honor. For 3 hours, Judge Gaines sat in silence, and when the hearing ended, he stood, closed his notebook, and walked out the same way he came in, without a word, without waiting for applause. But behind him, he left a room full of people who suddenly realized they'd been performing for an audience of one, and they had failed the audition. That same week, Vincent recorded a confession. No lawyer present, no script, just a camera, a producer, and the weight of everything he'd finally started to understand. I used to think I was doing the right thing, Vincent said, voice hollow. I followed protocol. I used the language I was trained in. But then I realized there are moments when not letting emotion in is the problem. Because emotion is what lets you see someone as human, not just as a subject. He looked directly into the camera. I stopped him because I couldn't reconcile the man and the car, the face and the way he looked at the road. His calmness didn't match my expectations. And that's the terrifying part. The video lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Within days, it was being used in police academies and law schools across the country. Not as an example of redemption, but as a warning. At home, Vincent's son stopped talking to him. The boy had taken down the drawing he'd made years ago, the one of them both in police uniforms with the words, "When I grow up, I'll be like Dad." He'd folded it carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer, where Vincent used to keep his service weapon. One night, Vincent found his son sitting in the dark, clutching his civics homework. The assignment asked, "What makes a good citizen?" His son had written, "Not someone who follows the rules. Someone who doesn't make others afraid when they walk into a room." Vincent tried to speak, tried to explain, but his son just looked at him with eyes that had once been full of admiration and were now full of something else, disappointment. And Vincent realized in that moment that he'd lost something no tribunal could ever restore. The image of a father his son wanted to become. Somewhere across the state, Judge Gaines sat alone on a nameless road beneath eucalyptus trees, a notebook in his lap. He wrote nothing new, just preserved the shape of an old habit. He had not asked for this moment, had not wanted to become a symbol. But his silence had done what 1,000 speeches could not. It had made people stop, look inward, and ask the one question no system wants to face. How long did we stay silent before one man had to speak for all of us? The children were the first ones brave enough to ask what the adults couldn't answer. In a small classroom in Illinois, a teacher wrote 2 words on the board, "Good citizen." It was supposed to be a simple lesson. Obey laws, respect others, keep promises. But then a boy raised his hand, slow and deliberate, like he was lifting something heavy. "Miss," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "if someone follows the rules but hurts other people, are they still a good citizen?" The room went silent. Not the restless silence of bored students, but the heavy silence of people who know they've just heard something true and terrifying. The teacher didn't have an answer in her lesson plan. No textbook offered guidance. So she did something she'd never done before. She tore up the day's curriculum, wrote 3 words on the board, hurt but legal, and said, "This is what we'll talk about today, maybe all week." By the end of that day, students had filled notebooks with questions no one had taught them to ask. If I make someone sad but don't get in trouble, does that mean I'm right? If grown-ups do wrong but the law says it's okay, should I grow up like them or like what's good? Why does justice need a video to be believed? One of those pages, wrinkled, written in shaky pencil, was photographed and posted online. No caption, no explanation. Just a child's question, if the right thing makes people quiet, is it still right? Within 24 hours, it had been shared 700,000 times. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, people whose entire careers were built on having answers suddenly stopped, stared at their screens, and realized a child had just asked what they'd spent decades avoiding. Schools across the country began implementing something they called unwritten questions, A monthly session where students could ask anything and teachers weren't allowed to dismiss them with easy answers. Not to solve, not to grade, just to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. In one Michigan classroom, a third grader stood up during the first session, voice shaking. "If I see someone get blamed unfairly and my teacher says nothing, should I stay quiet when I grow up?" The faculty didn't answer, but they did something else. They revised the staff handbook for the first time in 20 years. Because if the adults with degrees and experience couldn't answer a child's question, maybe the problem wasn't the question. Maybe the problem was them. And everywhere in hospitals, courtrooms, police stations, people began to change, not because a law told them to, but because they couldn't look a child in the eye and defend what they'd been doing. Small gestures appeared, quiet ones, the kind that don't make headlines, but reshape entire communities. In Oregon, tiny 3D printed fedoras, replicas of the hat Judge Gaines wore in that video, started appearing on car license plates. No one sold them officially. No campaign promoted them. People just made them and attached them to their cars like silent declarations. "I saw it. I will not look away." At a courthouse in Nebraska, clerks stopped asking, "What's your name?" and started asking, "What would you like me to call you properly?" A small gesture. But for people who'd spent lifetimes being misnamed, mispronounced, dismissed, it was the first time the system adjusted itself to acknowledge they were never the error. In police stations, changes rippled through like aftershocks. A lieutenant in Minneapolis updated the night shift protocol. "Before you fill out a citation, ask, 'Can I confirm the spelling of your name so I don't get wrong?'" It seemed small, procedural, but it forced officers to pause, to look at the person in front of them, to remember they were writing about people, not case numbers. In Des Moines, an elderly man wept when an officer asked him to spell his name correctly. The citation had listed his deceased son's name. Same surname, same birthday. The mistake wasn't malicious, but the pain was real. The shift commander, shaken, hand-wrote a new policy memo. From now on, never let someone's name be mistaken for the one they lost. And in Chicago, a precinct supervisor began requiring officers to submit personal reflections after filing reports, not to evaluate feelings, but to remind them that every report they wrote was a moral footprint they were leaving behind. One rookie officer wrote, "I'm not sure I'm detached enough to write objectively when they look at me like they're about to disappear." The supervisor read it aloud at the next team meeting, then folded the paper and said quietly, "We won't file another report unless we know who we're writing about and why." Vincent Cole heard about these changes, not through the news. He'd stopped reading headlines, but through the eyes of people he passed on the street. They no longer looked at him like a threat, but they didn't look at him with trust either. They looked at him like an old ink stain on clean paper, not big enough to tear the page, but enough that no one would dare write on it again. His son still barely spoke to him. The boy had moved the old drawing, the one of them in matching police uniforms, into the bottom drawer where Vincent used to keep his service weapon. Both put away, both never to be used again. One evening, Vincent found a note his son had written for civics class. "The person I want to be is someone who says nothing but makes others start saying the right things." Vincent read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet next to his badge. A reminder, not of who he was, but of who his son would never want to become. And then came the moment that would define everything. At Northwind University, a conference on justice reform filled an auditorium with lawmakers, academics, and policy experts. The program was planned down to the minute. Speeches, panels, awards, and then Judge Franklin O.L.L. Gaines walked in. No one had invited him. No seat was reserved. But he entered anyway, moved through the rows, and sat in the back, fifth row from the exit. He opened his plain notebook, pulled out a pencil, and began to write. The entire room shifted. Conversations dimmed. People straightened in their chairs, not out of fear, but because everyone suddenly understood. Some people don't need to speak for the entire room to reconsider how their words land. For 2 hours, speakers gave polished presentations, statistics, reform proposals, carefully worded statements. And Judge Gaines said nothing, just sat there, writing. And then, when the session was nearly over, he stood. Slowly, he walked to the podium, not via the main stairs, but around the side, forcing every eye in the room to follow him. He didn't bring notes, didn't adjust the microphone. He just looked out at the hundreds of faces staring back at him and asked one question. At this point, who among you still believes I didn't know is an acceptable answer? The room went silent. Not the silence of people waiting for more, the silence of people being forced to confront themselves. 1 second, 2, 10. No one answered. Because the question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to live in memory, in conscience, in every future decision where ignorance could no longer be an excuse. Judge Gaines stepped off the podium and walked out the same way he came in. No applause, no farewell, just the sound of his footsteps echoing through a room that would never forget what it felt like to be seen through. Weeks later, a law school in Massachusetts printed that question on the back of every graduation folder. No explanation, no context. Students carried it with them as they entered courtrooms, police stations, hospitals. A reminder that some questions don't need answers. They just need to be remembered. Vincent never spoke to Judge Gaines again, never apologized, never asked for forgiveness, because he understood something now that he hadn't before. Some things you break can't be fixed. They can only be learned from. He stayed in the records department, filed paperwork, kept his head down, and every day when he walked past the recruitment posters in the hallway, young officers in crisp uniforms smiling with confidence, he thought about his son's question, should I grow up like them or like what's good? And he hoped with everything he had left that his son would choose differently. Judge Franklin O.L.L. Gaines never gave another interview, never wrote a memoir, never allowed his name to be used in campaigns or on monuments. He moved to the suburbs to a quiet road lined with eucalyptus trees where he walked each morning with a notebook tucked in his coat pocket. Not to write anything new, just to preserve the habit of paying attention. People still spoke of him, but not by name. They said things like, the one who made me rewrite how I file reports, or the one who made me realize silence is also an answer. In his final years, a used bookstore in Kansas placed a wooden chair near the law section. Carved into the backrest were 5 words, not for the famous, for those who make others rethink. Visitors would sit for a moment, then leave behind slips of paper with confessions they'd never said aloud. I once stayed silent when I should have spoken. I didn't know, but I should have tried to learn. I was wrong, and I'm trying to do better. When Judge Gaines passed away, there was no state funeral, no televised memorial, just a small gathering on that nameless road beneath the eucalyptus trees where a handful of people stood in silence. One of them was a young officer new to the force, fresh out of the academy. He'd never met Judge Gaines, but he carried with him a laminated card, something his training instructor had given him on his first day. It read, before you ask for someone's ID, ask yourself, am I treating them the way I'd want my father treated? The officer didn't know where the quote came from, but he knew it had changed him, made him pause, made him see, and that in the end was the legacy Judge Franklin O.L.L. Gaines left behind. Not monuments or medals, but moments, small, quiet moments where people stopped, looked at each other, and chose dignity over procedure. Because some people don't need to speak to change the world. They just need to make the world stop long enough to question itself. If this story made you feel something, if it made you pause, reflect, or question, don't let it scroll past like just another video. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken? Have you ever seen something wrong and looked away? Your voice matters, and when enough of us speak up, Silence is no longer an option. Hit subscribe if you believe stories like this need to be told. Because the truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be heard. See you in the next one.